What's up YouTube? Today we are demystifying Disperser, probably one of the most confusing plugins out there. You find a lot of YouTubers do mention it in their videos and they say it's a great tool, but one thing that I've noticed a lot of them say is something along the lines of, I don't quite know what it's doing, but it sounds good. So in this video, I kind of just want to outline the science behind what it's doing. I'm not going to give you too much contextual examples, but this is part of a kind of series of videos that I'm doing specifically on Cytron's baselines. So I'm going to feature this technique in next week's video, but also just knowing what this plugin does is going to make this kind of processing just a little bit easier to understand. Anyway, let's dive in and have a look. So for the purpose of this video, I'm going to be enlisting the help of Plugin Doctor, which is a very interesting plugin that kind of analyzes the frequency, phase, and all sorts of different responses that certain audio plugins give you. You can use this to compare two different of the same vintage emulations to see their slight differences, or you could use it to kind of recreate certain plugins in other plugins or presets from one plugin in another one. One downside is it doesn't work with synths, it's just effects based. That being said, it's still a very interesting thing for being able to understand stuff like what exactly Disperser is doing to your sound. So I think first and foremost, the most important thing to understand is what multiband processing is. So here I've got kilohertz snap heap, and inside snap heap, I'm just going to load a multipass. So for those who don't know what multipass is, this is essentially kilohertz's answer to stuff like FabFilter Saturn, Waves TransX, Waves Vitamin. It's essentially a multiband processor that allows you to add any type of processing to any chain that you want. So for example, we could recreate something like FabFilter Saturn in multipass. We could create something like Waves TransX in multipass. So just a quick example is Waves TransX is essentially a multiband transient shaper. So if we split our frequencies into multiple bands, apply a transient shaper onto each one, we've essentially created a quick and dirty remake of something like the Waves TransX. Obviously, this is not exactly the same until you actually go into the frequency and phase response and start to tweak things exactly so that it responds exactly how the plugin responds. So this is particularly interesting if you want to create certain presets within those plugins, but one interesting thing that's kind of become very common in sound design in the last few years is just the sound of multiband processing itself. Clean, without any effects like saturation or transient shaping or anything like that. And not just multiband processing, the ability to actually stack multiband processes. So this is obviously something that's become more common as computers get more powerful and CPUs allow for more and more intense processing. But these types of things were possible in the past by just rendering a sound over and over and over again. So I guess you did see this kind of thing, you know, in the past, but it's become more and more popular, and almost certain genres you can actually see them, these types of processes being part of regular chains that you see. For example, like heavy bass genres, a lot of stacking of multiband stuff is quite prominent. In Cytron's basslines, you see a lot of people processing the bass with multiband stuff, specifically Waves TransX, Waves Vitamin, FabFilter Saturn. But in a lot of the examples that you see people using these, they'll often just leave a clean chain. They won't apply any saturation or anything like that just to get the sound of multiband. So essentially, I guess, kind of multiband is supposed to be clean. So there's various different kind of tricks that they use to kind of retain a clean frequency response when you send a sound in and out. So for example, you can see here, this is the frequency response of what's happening in Snap Heap. So if I just disable multipass and I put in a filter, you can see immediately the filter is represented in this curve. Using this theory, we can deduce that multipass is not affecting the frequency response of the sound. However, due to the nature of filters and just the way that, you know, these two filters that are splitting the sound are overlapping, there's going to be some kind of interaction in the sound. So I guess that's one of the trade-offs when you look at certain different types of processing. You're either going to have nonlinear frequency response, or you're going to have a nonlinear phase response. That's just kind of one of the downsides of DSP processing, I guess. So if we look at the phase response of what's happening in multipass, you'll see that it's not necessarily linear. The amount of rotations is determined by the amount of filters in the split. So each of these kind of upward lines represents where the signal hits 180 degrees and then flips its phase 100% inverted and then starts going back to 0 again. So if we jump into multipass and just reduce the amount of filters that are being split here, so let's say, for example, it's just one frequency split, you'll see that it's represented in this chart. Okay, so you'll see this kind of phase rotation used as a sound design tool in a lot of modern bass genres, because you're able to get a very pronounced low frequency signal, but still a pretty complex harmonic. So it's able to cut through the mix quite nicely, retain some good transients and that kind of thing. I'm going to continue that side of the discussion in next week's video, more kind of in-depth bass processing techniques and that kind of thing. So for this video, I kind of want to take the idea of what we're seeing here in this graph. And so bear in mind, I don't have FabFilter Satin and I don't have Waves Vitamin, so I can't show you those exact plugins. But that being said, is I have got charts that some of my Patreons and stuff have sent me that represent shapes that are very similar to this with all of those plugins. Take this into account, the idea of multiband processing not actually affecting the frequency of the sound, but affecting the phase of the sound. So the idea there is that's still going to affect the sound somewhat. It's going to affect the waveform, and then further down the chain, depending on what else you process, it's going to affect it. So what I want to do here, I want to load up Kilohertz's famed Disperser plugin. So I guess one of the confusing things about the plugin is I think it would be a really cool kind of addition if the interface actually displayed some kind of phase rotation graph like this. Because when I first started using the plugin, I wasn't quite sure, just naturally thinking this was some kind of filter, just kind of made things a little bit more confusing for me. So also the fact that the settings are very extreme on the default of the plugin. And I guess that is to make it sound obvious that the plugin is on. But at the same time, it kind of just makes things very confusing as to what's going on. So let's start to dial things back a little bit. The pinch, I don't tend to use that often in sound design because it makes the sound very pronounced. As you can see, what it's doing is it's actually pinching all of the rotations inwards, which is pretty interesting. It's basically like taking all of these and just shifting them inwards with a single parameter. I don't often use that, like I said, and generally what I'll do is I'll tend to kind of mix this down quite substantially. So let's say, for example, go for like 4 rotations and then somewhere in the mid-range over here, maybe even 5. So you see here we're getting something similar to what we would get by just using a traditional multiband process, and then we can still then take it to the far extremes, essentially stacking multiband processes. So for example here, look at this, what we're doing here. So we got 4 rotations with the amount knob at like 10%. If we jump back into this snap heap and duplicate this multipass and drop it here, remember that example I said earlier about stacking multiband processes and the way that, in more modern music, it's becoming more of a thing because CPUs and computers allow for it. So here, essentially what we're doing by turning up the amount is just adding extra phase rotations. You see, so obviously they're not exact. You can go and fine tune them if you want, but it doesn't really matter all that much in my opinion. It's just about having those rotations that kind of gets that sound. Again, I'm going to make more examples in next week's video. Just kind of trying to explain the science here. We could just keep going like 4, 5, and then this is something along these lines, So imagine this being 10 multipasses, right? Boom, 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 boom. 10 multipasses. I think that's about what this amount can get you to. I'm not 100% sure exactly, but this disperser is kind of a simulation of stacking multiband effects. Being able to get the same sound of a 10 stack of multipasses, but without the hit on your CPU. On top of that, it gives you the ability to modulate, do this kind of pinch thing, which would be to modulate all of those band split offsets with a single parameter. Again, this gets a little bit extreme, you know, doing these kinds of things gets a bit extreme to the sound. But, you know, if that's what you want to do, you want to create these weird variations, it's sometimes pretty good on acid leads and that kind of thing, you can do that. So I just want to give you a quick audio example here. So let's just say add a vital over here. I'm going to add a disperser. I'm going to tune this down to roughly where it was in the plugin. I think it was about like G5 or so, somewhere around there. And what I want to do is I want to apply an oscilloscope over here, so I can show you guys the frequency response or the waveform result of the saw wave that's run through this band split effect or just disperser in general. So it doesn't look like a saw wave. It sounds somewhat like a saw wave, but it has a very ringy, almost texture to it. And I'm telling you now, check out your Cytron's bass sample packs and check out the waveform on those packs. A lot of them are going to have this similar wobbly kind of sound as opposed to just a straight up saw wave. I usually aim for something that looks kind of like this. It's almost like a straight wobble that kind of, it looks like a kick's waveform, where it's fast and then it goes slower. But the weird thing is that it's a stable pitch. So the cool thing about this is you're not going to have any type of phase problems with the kick, because technically the waveform is going to be different. You see, there's no sine waves that are going to interact with that fundamental sine wave of the kick drum. So again, this is another very interesting technique, but we're going to dive a little bit further into this in next week's video. I hope you guys enjoyed that. Let me know what you think in the comments. I'll see you guys next time. Don't forget to hit that like button, hit that subscribe button. I'll see you guys next time. Cheers.